Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the birthplace of Congregational Humanism. We carry on that tradition of free thought today, dedicated to promoting a free search for truth, meaning, and justice. Our web address is firstunitarian.org. I'm David Breeden, Senior Minister. Welcome. Well, some good news on the humanism front this week. First is the Pope is being accused of being a humanist. Heresy, heresy. And in terms of humanism anyway, Scotland is now officially a majority non-religious nation, the first one in Europe by census. Now, I'm going to be doing some detective work today, and I'll be looking at some people from the American Civil War period. After all, this is Memorial Day weekend, a holiday that began in 1868 to honor those killed in that war, later expanded to honor all those killed in our many wars. The best book that I know of that focuses on the war, the real death of the war, is Drew Gilpin Faust's This Republic of Suffering, Death in the American Civil War. It is an eye-opening book. I remember as a kid walking through the family graveyard seeing only the dead from 1862. Why? I didn't know then, but that's when they stopped hauling the dead soldiers back. There were just too many of them, so it didn't happen anymore. In addition to the roughly 600,000 soldiers killed in those 4 years, roughly 50,000 civilians died. And that is an eye-opening book. I also brought show and tell today. My great-grandfather was in the Civil War. He was a drummer at 12 years old, and he was at the Battle of Vicksburg, and he brought that cannonball back. That actually is a small one. That's a naval. Vicksburg, there was a naval battle because from the Mississippi River, actually. So, yes, the land-based ones were considerably larger. And yes, all they were really doing was throwing smelted iron at each other at very fast speeds. That's what people tend to do. I thought I would dwell a bit on the Civil War this morning, taking a look at how the radical edge of thinking at that time leads directly to why this congregation is here today. Talking about the long trajectory of liberal Protestant theology is not easy. Rev Kelly and I were just discussing that. It can be really confusing out there. The story is long and confusing, and there are subtle differences that have made a huge difference in that trajectory. And I'm here because of the radical wing of that particular way of thinking. And it's why many of us can wholeheartedly agree with the words of Frederick Douglass concerning religion. I bow to no priests either of faith or of unfaith. I claim as against all sorts of people simply perfect freedom of thought. And a t-shirt that all of our E-squared kids might want to wear. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. It's really that simple, isn't it? While I'm recommending summer reads, I should add the magisterial biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, by David W. Blight. A brilliant book, and do go to the slide of it. If you got nothing else to do this summer, I mean, this is comprehensive. You also may know that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed face of the 19th century anywhere in the world. Now, you have to think about that for a moment. Why was that happening? Was it that white Americans were finally willing to look into the face of what they had done? And I think that might have something to do with it. Today I want to talk about a book that came out in March of this year, An Emancipation of the Mind, Radical Philosophy, the War Over Slavery, and the Refounding of America by Matthew Stewart. This is a magisterial reading of how radical liberal theology came into the American Civil War thinking, and probably is what actually caused the war, quote unquote. But first, let's look at the study where Frederick Douglass wrote during his final years. The house is now a National Historic Site near Washington, D.C., and that is Frederick Douglass's writing desk, you see. Then, if you look on the other side, his fireplace, you will see an old white guy on the mantle. Now, that old white guy is a German theologian and philosopher, Ludwig Feuerbach, a name almost nobody knows today. The book, An Emancipation of the Mind, explores three people who were philosophers, if you will, responsible for the drive to the war over the question of slavery. Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and the Unitarian minister Theodore Parker. Both Douglass and Lincoln were avid readers of Parker's sermons. Now, put a pin in that one, and let's take a look at the great divide in liberal religion, and I'll come back to this, specifically liberal Protestantism. This is the definitive philosophical, theological separation in Protestantism, those two guys, believe it or not. The two great thinkers of liberal religion were both German, because most of the European theological thinking in the 19th century came from German universities. Why? Because Britain is and was a theocracy. You don't get to talk about it much there. The two were Ludwig Feuerbach, 1804 to 1872, whose taste in wallpaper was decidedly darker than Douglass's, as you can see, and Friedrich Schleiermacher. Now, why are these two fellows the architects of the great divide in liberal Protestantism? Schleiermacher wrote the book On Religion, Speeches to Its Culture Despisers. Published in 1799, the title pretty well summarizes the argument of the book. Don't be such a culture despiser. We need to look at liberal religion, and I think we can save it, said Schleiermacher. And that is one way that liberal Christianity went. It's the way that most liberal congregations preach today, including most Unitarian Universalist congregations, okay? That's over there. It's a compromise with the past, and it's a way of preserving the future, this tradition into the future. Then there is the Feuerbach book, published 42 years later in 1841, called The Essence of Christianity. Now, it's important to notice when these two books were translated into English. All right? The Schleiermacher book came very late to translation in 1893 into English. Yet, as I said, Schleiermacher's ideas are much more influential in United States religion. So, why is that? Because many of the leading American theologians of the day learned German, and many studied in German universities. So the creme de la creme of liberal religion was learning German, actually to read German, who knows how well, and also going on over to study in the actual theological schools of Germany, what we call Germany today. Now, why had Feuerbach's book, which is much more radical, though, comes earlier into the English language, 1855, in the violent years leading up to the American Civil War, when it was getting at its most heated. So Parker, Douglass, and Lincoln were all moved by the Feuerbach book. They read it, and they loved it, and that's why this old German was looking over Frederick Douglass's shoulder as he wrote. The book was available in English early on because of a British Unitarian woman, Marian Evans, known by the masculine name of George Eliot. Notice, George Eliot. You know her from Victorian novels, right? Well, why was she doing that? Because this was a way of escaping patriarchy. She felt driven into being a female novelist, which, her pretty little head could only think about relationships, right? Well, she was kind of going to break out of that, she thought. Why was the avant-garde among Protestant thinkers so taken by this book? because it said things such as this. Quod supra nos nihil ad nos, which means what is above us does not concern us. That's actually Epictetus from Roman times. A God who inspires us with no human emotions, who does not reflect our own emotions, in a word, who is not a human, such a God is nothing to us, has no interest for us, does not concern us. Totally disconnected God? Why should we care? And this one, religion is the dream of the human mind. But even in dreams, we do not find ourselves in nothing. We are in the realm of reality, in the realm of the concrete. We only see things in a disjointed and disconnected way. All religious views are anthropomorphisms, which is to say, man's view of God is nothing else than man's view of himself. All right? And this is the founding of the idea of humanism. This is where it comes from. And I'm going to update that a little bit just so it makes a little more sense to us. I think that George Eliot would highly approve of us fixing the sexist language. Religion is the dream of the human mind. All religious views are anthropomorphisms, which is to say, the human view of God is nothing else than humanity's view of ourselves. Feuerbach's point is clear and simple. Religion is anthropology. All religions and religious ideas all over the earth are products of the human mind. Asking a person to describe their God is sort of like the old game of picking your favorite Beatle when I was a kid. Whether you like John, Paul, George, or Ringo, it shows a whole lot about your own personality, right? And I'm a John Lennon guy. By the same token, the necessarily anthropomorphic, the human emotions and actions of a God that a person describes, that's the person's personality, right? They are expressing their own deepest concerns. You can see why a female British novelist who felt so constrained by a patriarchal social system based in Christianity heard this as really good news, right? It was a lightning bolt. All the social oppressions based in Christian teachings in the Bible, human beings had made it all up. It's the first time anyone had expressed that news. None of them, Douglas, Parker, or Lincoln, could say this aloud, of course. Not in 19th century America. That would have been the end of their public careers. But if you look, you can see it. You can see why leaders in a largely Christian nation where the Bible was being used to justify enslavement, you can see why this new idea was a lightning bolt. Frederick Douglass, Theodore Parker, and Abraham Lincoln had to find a way somehow to say that the Bible isn't always right. It's that simple. This was especially good news to Frederick Douglass, who often said that the most Christian masters were the worst because they felt utterly justified in their cruelty to enslaved Africans because they were property, said the Bible. Okay? Feuerbach's book is the beginning of humanism as we know it today. Humanism, because some people were willing to take up Feuerbach's call to take human responsibility for human-created problems. If the humans created the Bible, the humans created slavery, humans created the republic that we call the United States, we can fix it. That is why the bust of an old German white guy had pride of place on Frederick Douglass's fireplace mantel, and you can go see it today. I'm hoping someday that Jay will take students on a Black liberation trip, because from there, and Jay, you've been there, start there and then go see what W.B. Du Bois is going to say about this, right? We can trace how this is going to work from one generation to the next in terms of human liberation. Now, this is why I'm a humanist. Humanism is, as George Eliot phrased it, principally about choice, right? The strongest principle of growth lies in human choice, individual human choice. But freedom of choice in a very particular way. Once we realize that all structures, from government to sexism to morality to structural racism, are all the products of human beings. And those human beings and those human actions can be reversed. They can be changed. Slavery, clearly approved of in the Bible, is wrong. Gender oppression, clearly approved of in the Bible, is wrong. So, trivia question. Who is the most famous disciple of Feuerbach? Karl Marx. Yeah, you got it. Right? Now, Karl Marx, whose philosophy begins in the assumption that human beings deserve to be fully actualized as human beings simply because a human being is a human being without reference to race, nationality, gender, social class, and all those other things. That's the early Marx, instead of the later one who gets very confused with the kind of a off-the-wall economic theory. However confused those economic theories are, Marx's big idea is that all human beings must be born and live in freedom, period. Human beings matter more than property. Why don't we achieve that? Kind of simple idea, it seems to me. Well, because, the Bible says, by their fruits ye shall know them. And I've got a lot of fruit, so I ain't sharing with nobody. And the Bible says, I must be holier than you because I've got more than you. So there. Which comes down to, I got mine and I ain't sharing. Right? Feuerbach is why the first Humanist Manifesto says, quote, we insist upon a shared life in a shared world. Yeah, that kind of sounds like Marx. It also sounds like Feuerbach. You got yours? Well, Feuerbach says, look at the system, the human created system that gave you what you've got. Look at it, consider it, and that is a human created system. And it's wrong for most human beings. Then we have to do some thinking about that. Who built the systems that we live in? You can see why many people have found it convenient to run back to human-created gods who will reassure them that what they've got is just fine, and they're just fine people. Thus, you can see why and how Parker, Douglas, and Lincoln used the scriptures, the common currency of 19th century American thought, to say why they needed to do this. They used the scriptures and then kind of cherry-picked like we all do when you use scriptures, right? They could not shout the good news of Feuerbach. That kind of thinking is still way outside of the American experience. I can say it here today because we are in that tradition. Yet for me anyway, when I realized Feuerbach's point, I cannot in good conscience be anything but a humanist. Because we know that we are responsible, not the gods we have invented to tell us we're right. Now, let's fast forward to 1924, to the time called the fundamentalist modernist debates. Now take a look at this dashing fellow here in the corner. He is labeled modernist by a fundamentalist cartoonist from 1924. Who does that look like? John Dewey, the guy whose educational model we are following in our E-squared program. Now, that's John Dewey, whose ideas we've been using, but we want to raise our congregation's children to realize that they are free to think, because Dewey is in the Feuerbach tradition, right? Now, hear what I'm saying. Part of John Dewey's tradition is the philosophical tradition of pragmatism, which says that all ideas are tools. Don't judge the ideas of others. Their gods may be fine for where they are. That's why people mistakenly say that Marx said religion is the opiate of the people. He did say that, but he said that's because most people are oppressed. They're driven to the particular kinds of religions that tell them that God wants them to work for pennies in a factory. The modernist is saying, "Behold thy God, O church, that will bring thee into the promised land." Now, if you look closely, I think you can see, if we can go back to the slide just a moment. Oh, thanks, yeah. Uh-oh, well, no, don't break anything, it's all good, yeah. Okay, what is that? Is that a Trojan horse? Is that, it's the wisdom of this world anyway, not quite sure. But if you look at it closely, it's standing on a foundation of Darwinism, philosophic speculation, shorter Bible, which means that at that time they were discovering that many of the books of the Bible are actually forgeries, right? They're not by the people they pretend to be by, right? At that time. Rationalism, religious evolution of man. The religious evolution of man, meaning that religion changes over time to meet social circumstances, which every liberal Christian believes, but every fundamentalist fundamentally does not believe. And it's very important to remember that difference, okay? Religious ideas change over time, or they don't, in which case you're going to be a fundamentalist and go back. Fundamentalists, slavery's still okay, people. That's 1924. A decade before the first Humanist Manifesto, signed by John Dewey and our minister here, John Dietrich. Dietrich's humanist message was so popular, remember, in the early days that they had to meet in theaters downtown. Many people at that time were hearing the message of human liberation that George Eliot, Parker, Douglas, and Lincoln had heard 50 years previously. These links, my great-grandfather was 12 when someone shot this at him. Then my grandfather was born in the 1890s. My mother was born in the 1930s. I was born in the 1950s. So it's not that far away. And that's why it was still sitting on a shelf when I was a little kid. The message is still with us today. As Dewey phrased it, if we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's students, we rob them of tomorrow. Very simply. Which, I can rephrase a little bit. If we teach millennials as we taught boomers, we rob them of tomorrow, right? If we teach Gen Z as we taught millennials, we rob them of tomorrow. Well, why do we care? Because we know in our bones that human beings create human problems, and human beings can solve human problems. We know that pluralism is beautiful because we know that the human mind is beautiful. We know that the full range of human cultures out there is beautiful. The full range of human religions is beautiful, but they're all human. We know that the beautiful diversity of human cultures reflects the beauty of the human mind, and that beautiful diversity should never be assimilated into anything like that old melting pot idea. Hatred of the other and othering of the other is nothing new to the human mind or to the nation that has accepted those human beings over time. You notice the Uncle Sam is frowning because it says that the scum rises to the top. Also, you see citizenship and equal rights. We just can't get that Eastern European who has those communist and anarchist thoughts. We just can't mix him in. We got to exclude those liberal Feuerbachians out of what we're going to do. So, assimilation is not freedom. The melting pot was not freedom. My mother's family had to forget German during the First World War or else. Right? It was really as simple as that. I wish I'd known about Feuerbach's idea when I was 12 years old. If I had, my life would have been a lot more smooth. I was born into a Pentecostal family, and it was the 1960s, and the preacher said to me that miniskirts were more evil. God cared more about that than carpet bombing children in Vietnam. All right? And I said, I don't think that makes much sense. Now, 12-year-olds in my fundamentalist tradition are supposed to be reading the Bible, which I was, and I began to think about what Jesus was. My Jesus in Pentecostalism was a Green Beret carpet-bombing Jesus. I thought maybe Jesus was a socialist, and that's who I fell back on. And now you see Green Beret Jesus is still in our fundamentalist white churches, very much so. And yes, this is a verse from the King James Version of the Bible. He who hath no sword, Jesus said, let him sell his cloak and buy one. Now, a sword was the highest tech personal weapon in the day when Jesus was alive. And guess what's the best, highest tech personal protection device in our own day? Yeah, so we have AR-15 Jesus. That's really bad thinking, isn't it? 12-year-olds in fundamentalist tradition have to read the Bible. I found a socialist Jesus who was quite different than that. The old melting pot metaphor for the U.S. still has some resistance is futile power to it. This is an antique flag that doesn't say what you think it is. It does, if you're reading it with contemporary eyes. Native Americans, beware of foreign influence, which we wish they had done. But unfortunately, this was not a native writing that. Who are the Native Americans, and what is foreign influence? I think that's a question. In 1855, most Americans were content to live in a Christian nation whose largest industry was the enslavement of Africans, the largest industry in the nation of the time. And of course, I have to say they were exploited Africans because there were very, very few African Americans during the war, before the war, because Africans weren't citizens. As a matter of fact, they were considered property just like horses and pigs and cows, and could be treated accordingly, and were. Eventually, people in our tradition of freedom convinced enough Americans to fight and die to assert, and this is very important, to assert human rights over property rights. That's really what the Civil War was about, asserting human rights over property rights. Because the greatest property, the most valuable property in this nation, were enslaved Africans. So if you're going to end slavery, you got to take the property and make that property human. And that's what these three great leaders were doing. All right? Human rights over property rights. And our tradition of pluralism continues to fight that battle. Human beings matter more than the gods and the laws that we human beings create. It's really that simple. Memorial Day began by commemorating the sacrifice of those 600,000 and more military dead from that battle between human rights and property rights. And it's still about freedom, and the perfect freedom that Frederick Douglass achieved and that every citizen of our nation deserves to achieve. He said, I bow to no priest, either of faith or of unfaith. I might move back and forth. I'm free to do it, right? I claim as against all sorts of people simply perfect freedom of thought. Thank you. Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.